Rabbi Block. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. B'shut my parents and b'shutchem. I've been teaching for many years now, and I was thinking about it on my way here, that this is actually, I think this might be the first shir I've ever given in Yerushalayim Yer Kodesh. And if nothing else was the case, if this shul and its storied history, the place that I've been coming really since I'm 10 years old, if that wasn't the case, this would be a very special opportunity. But to do it in this Makom Kadosh here that has really been a special part of my experience of Pt1 Akdosha as I came as a visitor, and now since I've been in Oleh for the last 2 years, it really is a special opportunity. And that also is separate from the actual topic that we have to discuss tonight, which is makes everything doubly meaningful to me. We find ourselves right now in a tkufa of the year, a time period of the year that is meaningful and significant and multifaceted. And when my wife, we were both educators in the States and in different ways. And my wife, who did a lot of programming in the school she used to work in, used to call this the season of the Yoms, right? Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, right? The season of the Yoms. And there's a lot of different themes that we are going to be addressing this time of year, coming out of Pesach, of course, and then we find ourselves in Sefirat HaOmer as well. There's a lot going on the calendar. And when Rabbi Israel approached me and asked me to speak about this Tkufat Shana, I thought that we could try and approach this period of the year from many different perspectives and different aspects, having to do with the world of Halakha and the world of Tanakh, and the world of Chazal, and the world of Jewish history as well. But honestly, the original plan for tonight was going to be, presentation number 1, was going to be actually something that mostly focused on Chag HaPesach and the way in which Sefirat HaOmer follows as an aftermath of Chag HaPesach. But considering that we are now in the opening moments of Yom HaShoah v'Gvura, I thought it appropriate to begin with a discussion about that, and maybe talk about how I think it is related to, at its very root, when it was first established in 1951, how this day of Yom HaShoah is related to Sefirat HaOmer, and then we'll transition into what I'd like to do tonight for the big chunk of our discussion of Sefirat, to ask several questions based on how Sefirat HaOmer is presented in the Torah, and then I'd like to conclude with really just a sprinkling of an idea about Chag HaPesach. And hopefully that will whet all of our appetites for the coming weeks, as we have, because between all of the questions and all the discussions that I hope that we'll have the opportunity to at least see that there's a lot of chomer here to be discussed. So, where to start? What I have before you, what you have in front of you in source number 1 is, and I would like to read through it if we can. I cut out a significant portion of it, but what you have in front of you is the speech that was presented in the first Knesset in April of 1951 about the proposal to establish Yom HaShoah. So the day...
1851?
1951. Did I say 1851?
Yeah.
No.
Was it 18?
Okay, I apologize. 1951. There was no Knesset in 1851. But we can speak to the Ottomans, but ask them what they thought. Thankfully there was nothing to... there was no Shoah in 1951. Okay, so just a little bit of a background about the speaker. So the speaker, if you at the bottom of the source, I have a picture of him. The Chaver Knesset is on the middle of page 2. The Chaver Knesset that's speaking here is Rabbi Dr. Mordechai Nurach. Rabbi Dr. Mordechai Nurach was not as notable and renowned of a figure as some of the heads of the Mafdal, but he was a proud member of the Mafdal, of the Meflaget Dati Leumi, and the early iterations of the religious Zionist and Mizrahi parties that were a significant part of the first Knesset. The first Knesset, if you know a little bit about the history of the Knesset, the first Knesset, the United Mizrahi Party, which was what eventually morphed into the Mafdal, got 14 seats. They were the third largest party in the Knesset. They were about on par with Beirut. So the fact that this was a country at the time which was 90% Chiloni, And it had 40. You know, the fact that they got 14 seats in the Knesset was a demonstration of the fact that there really was a minority, to be sure, but a significant minority that was supportive of the world of religious Zionism, or at least religion and Zionism. It was a complicated mix. It always has been, and that was the first Knesset. One of the leaders of that Miflaga at the time was Mordechai Nurak. Now, his story is fascinating, and again, just by way of introduction, before we read what he had to say in 1951, Mordechai Nurak was from Latvia, and he was the son of the rabbi of his hometown in Latvia, and he was traditionally trained. He was a musmach l'rabbanut, and then he actually went to he went on to university and got a PhD in the 1913 or so, something around there, first decade of the 1910s. He went and got a PhD in philosophy, and then went back to Latvia and to his hometown and succeeded his father as the Rav of the city. And what's, I think, there are a lot of stories like that. I mean, he's deserving of our attention if for only that. But what was fascinating about him is that while he was a practicing, active European rabbi, he was a member of the national legislature in Latvia, which makes him, to my knowledge, I think, if not one of then the only of all of the founding Chavrei Knesset that actually had legislative experience somewhere other than Jewish politics, inter-Yishuv politics leading up to the Hakamat HaMdina. That is fascinating. That's a fascinating tidbit. In addition to that, so again, these stories are from the early generations of Toshavei Medinat Yisrael, of Ezrachei Medinat Yisrael. The story of Nurak is a tragic one, like it was for so many. He had a wife and two children, the Rebbitzin and two kids of the rabbi in his hometown in Latvia, and the Nazis got to both of them. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why, he wasn't in the city at the time when the Nazis invaded. So he was spared, and eventually, by the time he did get back, the Soviets had conquered the Baltic states from the Nazis, and then they threw all of the people that they suspected into the Gulag. So he came home to find his murdered wife and children, only to then be imprisoned by the Soviets. So it was, again, unfortunately not an original or unique story in that era. So he eventually makes his way within a couple of years to Eretz Yisrael. This is before Hakamat HaMdina. He's there for Hakamat HaMdina, and largely for his devotion and commitment to both, religious Zionism. He was a proud member of Mizrahi in Europe already. And then, because of, I can't imagine this wasn't a major factor, of his actual legislative experience, he became an indispensable and an invaluable a member of the first Knesset. Okay, so that's enough of the background about Mordechai Nurak. You can read up about him as a fascinating character and an important and one of the many unsung heroes of the early days of after the Hakamat HaMdina. So one of the first orders of business of the first Knesset, this was in 1949, and one of the first orders of business was to commemorate the Shoah. And it was a massively complicated thing in Israeli society. And ad kedei kach that in a way it was never fully resolved, because there was never one attitude or one idea about how to properly commemorate the Shoah. In the late 40s, there were some who wanted to make it purely a religious holiday. It was going to be whether it was going to be a fast day, whether it was going to be a national day of commemoration. There were many who thought that we should not have a day of commemoration at all. There was a lot that was going into that. The Holocaust, for many in the Yishuv, was a great embarrassment. The Yishuv, which was trying to project itself as this proud and strong and independent people, deserving and worthy of a state, all of their co-religionists, all of their brethren in Europe were, led like lambs to the slaughter, and that was a great embarrassment for them. And when they're looking at the governments and the leaders of the world in the face and telling them, you need to support us and allow us to be an independent country, they're all looking at them and saying, look at what your whole community did. You can't govern yourself. You can't even, you can't save yourself from anything. So why should we take you seriously? This was a great embarrassment for the Yishuv and in the early days of after the Hakamat HaMdina. And as a result, there was a lot of difference of opinions about how to properly commemorate the Shoah, and in order to deal with this, there was a couple of different things that were established. One of them was a va'adah that was established, a subcommittee in the Knesset, to throw around ideas about how to properly commemorate the Shoah. So, leading this Va'ada was Chaver Knesset Rav Dr. Mordechai Nurak, Zichrono Livracha, and this speech that he gave in April of 1951. If you're keeping score, this is in the middle, towards the end of the middle of the debate about German reparations in the Knesset that was roiling the whole country. Okay, there's a lot going on in the early 1951 in the Knesset. Begin resigned from the Knesset, and through a mass rally, he was calling for civil disobedience about this. He was saying that in the days of the Milchamah Shechur with the Altalina, we can't have internecine fighting, but for this we can. This was a very big thing that was tearing society apart. And in the middle of all of this Va'ada meets to try to present an idea, or at least come up with some ideas about how to properly commemorate the Shoah in the nascent Medinat Yisrael. And this speech that I'd like to read through right now, part of it at least, that I'd like to read through from Mordechai Nurak, who's the head of this Va'ada, is the presentation to the Knesset for the proposal that would eventually lead to what was established as what we know today as Yom HaShoah. Okay, so I'll let Chaver Knesset Nurak's words do the talking from here on in, but just to see what we're talking about. So just again, he's a survivor. His wife and children are victims. He was a educated and professional in Europe and a legislator from Europe, and now he's a member in the early years of the Knesset. Hashemayim, what is it? 5-minute walk from here in Pt1 is where the Knesset was meeting. Forgive me, this is like very meaningful for me to like be reading these words. The first time I read these words, I was in my old shul. I was a Rav Kehillah in the States. I was sitting in my office in Queens, and I'm reading these words really for the first time, literally a stone's throw from when they were first said. This is very powerful for me. Hashamayim bochim, Eretz bocha v'Yisrael bochim. The heavens are crying, the land is crying, the people are crying. Beit Gavoa Achim Achayot L'Tzara. בשם ועדת הכנסת אני מתכבד להופיע בפניכם בהצעה רצינית וחשובה. In the name of this subcommittee, I would like to make this proposal. כבר חל פה יותר מ6 שנים מאז הורם מסך הברזל מהמדינות שנכבשו על ידי הנאצים בימי מלחמת העולם השנייה. It's now been several years, 6 years, since the Iron Curtain has been lifted up from these European countries. When we discovered the bitter truth, we had this hope that we had that maybe this wasn't true. It was just bad rumors that everything was being destroyed. It was all a false hope. It was a meaningless, childish thing that we were clinging to think that maybe the destruction wasn't happening. 6 million people were killed, 1/3 of our people, Rov Baninu, the majority of our sons, the Dam Kar, in cold blood they were murdered. In a clear program, an engine of death. Avot banim anashim nashim mataf, fathers and sons, men, women, and children. Million, the 1.2 million. It's more than it ended up being more than this. 1.2 million children of Israel. Hanoar hayehudi tikvata va'atida shel ha'omah, the great hope and future of our people. She'achlu liyot l'tigila l'tiferet la'amenu v'l'noshiot kula. That could have been the great pride and joy of our people. These are not just poetic and flowery words. If you know anything about the early Yishuv, you know anything about the Zionist movement, the plan, Ben Gurion's master plan, Weizmann's master plan, Herzl's master plan was that we were going to take the 3 million Jews in Poland and just move them all here. The fact that there was a demographic problem because there were more Arabs than there were Jews, all of that was going to get solved because yes, there was 800,000, 900,000 Arabs living in Eretz Yisrael proper at the time, but we're going to move in 3-4 million Jews. That's going to solve all the demographic problems. All the hated Jews in Europe are going to come here. That was the big idea. It's not just poetic, flourish that Dr. Nurak is speaking here. This was a great source of dejection and misery for the founding fathers of Medinat Yisrael, because the people that were supposed to populate the state, they wanted it to be a Western European country. And the Western Europeans who were going to come here were now all gone. And again, this is I consider it the beauty and majesty of Medinat Yisrael that the people that did come ended up being all the people from the east. but the country ended up looking and developing very, very differently than all of these, upper crust, educated Europeans had in mind. So Dr. Nurak was as upper crust and elitist and as of a European Jew as there was, and absolutely, this is there's a lot to these lines. Okay, let's move on. So paragraph 2. Midbarav Istaima ba'ofen tragi tkufat ha'elav shel Yehudei Europa. The tkufat rabat arach. The long and proud and significant period, the 1,000 years of Jewry in Europe, is now done. Chirutim is v'zichronenu ha'chaim ha'tziburim ha'shlamim b'kehilot v'kibutzei ha'gola b'Europa. Remember, this is a European Jew talking, somebody who lived his adult life there, worked there, served in the national legislature there. Now we have these free thoughts of the beauty, the majesty of life, the cultural life of what it was like in the Gola. Hayeshivot hagdalot shishaman halach misofa alam miyad sofo. Right, the yeshivot that existed in Europe, the graduates, the people of which would cross the world and affect the world. Mostot b'farim, these great organizations, tarbutiyim, culture, kalkalimu, philanthropic organizations, istadriot, shonot, different organizations, yitonot, yomit gdola, sifriut. All right, so this was not somebody who was a graduate of Volozhin who was lamenting just the loss of the Torah of the yeshivas. So he absolutely was a committed and religious person. But this is the language of Mizrahi. This is the language of religious Zionism. He's lamenting not only the death of Torah, not only the death of the people, but the death of Jewish culture that was flourishing in Europe at the time. How many thousands of shuls, how many millions and millions of mitpalalim there. As the Pesach and Shavuot says, they were like a wind blew and they were no longer with us. This is the third churban of our people. Kol Yehudi yesh lo karagil yom zikaron. Every single Jew, nowadays in 1951, has a day of remembrance. Bo hu mityached im zichram shel yakarim v'achavivim lo. This is a time where he gets together with the people, his nearest and dearest, the ones closest to him or her. Vayamim shehalchu meito. Hem niftaru kederach kol aretz. Anu yodim matai azvu otanu. Anu ba'atzmenu huvlu otanu lekfurot. All right? V'yesh lanu tamid ha'efsharut lahorid al kivreim d'maot. We all have people, we all have relatives, we all have friends, we all know people who passed, who were killed, who were murdered in the Shoah. V'yimei simcha, in days of happiness. Uv'yimei toga, yishanu omdim al yad kivreim. When we stand to the side of their, above their graves, ki'ilu re'im anu lefanenu et hadmuyot ha'yikarot v'achavivot shel yikarenu v'achavivenu, ki'ilu shomim et kolam ha'mechamim et libenu. All right, so again, this is somebody who was not only culturally educated, Jew from Europe, but this is somebody who was also personally affected by the Holocaust, as was a great number of Jews at the Hakamat HaMedina. This was somebody that who felt this deeply. And he's speaking from personal experience here, thinking about the lost loved ones of the Shoah. Aval, Chaver Knesset HaYikarim, Achim HaAchayot Latzara. My brothers and sisters, the Chaver Knesset, you, the members of the Knesset, my brothers and sisters in pain. Acharu asug hasheni adol tiragil. None of this is not normal, right? This is ridiculous. This is crazy what we're doing. She'einanu yodim be'eza yomu be'eza shana. Like, how crazy is this situation? We're mourning over these millions of Jews. Be'einanu yodim be'eza yomu be'eza shana parchu nishmoteim atorot shel hakadoshim ve'echan yitpazer ofram. We have no idea when any of these people died. They were the engine of death carried these people off, hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands at a time, and we have no way of commemorating, of establishing any type of commemoration for them, because when did it happen? For most of us, right, nowadays, we're looking at maybe distant relatives. So we know in my family the traditional. So my grandparents, thank God, they made it out in the 30s. But my father's parents were in America already for several generations. My mother's parents were both born in Europe. They made it out in the 30s. Their parents made it out with them in the 30s. Their parents, was my great-great-grandparents, were all killed in the Shoah. And my grandparents, aunts, and uncles were all killed in the Shoah. And they were all from the same village in Romania. And traditionally, the art site that we had was the date that we knew was the date that the trains came to Transylvania and actually carted them off, because there was no yard site. There was no yard site. It's this time of year. It's in Sivan. It was right around Chag Shavuot that this happened in Transylvania.
I know a guy on Yom Kippur said to Kaddish for the Shuvah.
Yeah, so that's a very widely widely practiced custom, and part of it is because of that. Again, think about the level of indignity of everybody here, of what everybody experienced. Not only do you have to witness the brutal murder and the loss of your loved ones, but you can't even properly commemorate it. There's no grave to go to. There's no remains to bury. So this was a gaping wound for the early days of Medinat Yisrael. So this is somebody with his personal experience who's talking about it. So everybody has this zikaron, and we have how strange, how ridiculous is it that we don't even have a day to establish it. All right, we're in second to last paragraph on page 1. Last paragraph. Last sentence of the second to last paragraph. Not only did they take our loved ones, they took this nechama, they took this comfort from us by not giving us the opportunity to mourn them. Last paragraph. Even in the long, tragic, bloody history of the Jewish people. Titus, Andrianus, all of our long, bloody history that knew Paro, Nebuchadnezzar, Vespasian, Titus, Hadrian, the Harolot Havarot, the Crusaders, Alilot Dam, the well poisoning, the blood libels, the pogromim, Ein Dugma Lashvadat Shlish Me'ameinu B'Mitzurazu. As we all know, in the long history of the bloody history of the Jewish people, nothing ever was experienced like the experience of the Holocaust. Right, we're on page 2 now at the top. Ba'anu margishim tzorech nafshi tiv'i. We are experiencing, we are feeling this feeling this natural feeling in our souls. We need to have some way to connect to our lost loved ones. We want there to be one day established annually for all of them, in honor of all of those we lost. This day should be a day of togetherness, of joint commitment for the entire nation. Right? As borrowing the phrase, because there was no help from Makat B'chorot. There was no home in which nobody was affected. Okay? And if you weren't affected, then you knew somebody was affected. There's no family, no person in Klal Yisrael was not affected by this. So we need one day to rally around, one day in which we can actually have collective mourning. Our responsibility, again, this is somebody speaking as the head of a subcommittee of the Knesset, and he's presenting it. So all of this up until now was basically his introduction. It was his personal, he didn't mention his personal family, but it was very clearly colored by his personal tragedy, very clearly coming from somewhere in the way he was discussing this. He's very clearly speaking for a large portion of the people living in the early years of Medinat Yisrael. And now he wants to talk about what their legislative responsibility is. Second last paragraph. We have to make a commemorative day for our lost loved ones, for the Kedoshim, for the martyrs. We are proud of the people who actually rebelled in the ghettos, the uprisers of the ghettos. Those who saved and maintained the kavod of Am Yisrael. If anybody has ever read the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, it was a band of 150 people that was going up against the Nazi machine. It's gvura like we could not imagine. And a word about this in a second. Let me just finish the paragraph. These people who had these uprisings, my house is right next to Rehov Mordechai Analovich in Renana, where I live with my family. And for the first 6, 8, 10 months that we were here, anytime we got in the car, I would point out to my kids, who were pretty young, you guys know who Mordechai Analovich is? You guys know who Chaim Weizmann is? You guys know who so I would point out the street and say, do you know who this is? Until about 8, 10 months into this, my oldest said, Abba, enough! So hopefully when they're a little older. But I literally think about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, came out every single day, because Mordechai Analovich, who was the head of of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the street named right outside my front door. So these people who were like Analevich and the people who led these uprisings, they were the people that saved the pride of the Jewish people. Right? These ones who taught these animals that Jewish blood is not sheep. We are not like just sheep going to the slaughter. We know how to die with strength. We know how to die with pride. The death of people who are strong, people who are straight, people who are serious. Okay, so he's mentioning all of this. You'd think, what in the world does the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising have to do with this? If you know anything about, I'm sure we're all somewhat familiar, if you know anything about the history of the uprisings that existed in the times of the Shoah, they were few and far between. They were the exceptions that proved the rule. Basically, for any number of reasons, there are a lot of them, that's certainly not what we're here to discuss, but for the most part, all the things that Nurak is saying that the uprisers showed the Nazis is that we are not like lambs to the slaughter there, that we are people with pride, that we people know how to die with strength, and we know how to die with bravery. Most of those things were not on display for the overwhelming majority of the people that were murdered in the Shoah. And the fact that we have a minuscule number of exceptions, the fact that that's getting equal play in this speech is very, very telling. So I said before, this is a very, very contentious and difficult topic in the early days of the Hakamat Hamdina, which is why the original, this is in a different speech, but the original name proposed for Yom HaShoah was actually, has anybody ever heard this? The Yom Mered HaGitaot. Anybody know why Yom HaShoah is on Yom HaShoah, on the 27th of Nisan? Anybody know? It's an anniversary of one significant event. This is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began over Pesach. Anybody ever read Leon Uris's book, Milaytim? It's a fictionalized but historical novel about this. It was began, and they started to try and weed out the people that were hiding out in the Warsaw Ghetto. But the 27th of Nisan is traditionally the day that historians accept to be the day of the actual uprising. So it's backwards. It's backwards. If you think about it, it's backwards. Why is the day that we are marking national commemoration, national mourning of the Shoah? Why is it a day of the exception in which Jews actually acted like strong soldiers? And it's because this is the early ethos, the early just cultural moment in the Hakamat Hamdina, outside of the religious, outside of that small minority of the religious people in the country, and outside, which were still a minority, there was a significant number, but outside of at this time, the small number of the minority of survivors who were there. All these were two minorities. The majority of the country at this point, within a few years, the Edot HaMizrach are going to come, and they're going to basically equal the Ashkenazim in the country only within a few years. But at this point, still in 1949, 50, 51, the majority of the country are still European, Ashkenazi Jews. And at this stage, at this point, the European Ashkenazi Jews that were not survivors, that were here before the war, they didn't want to hear about Jewish weakness. They didn't want to hear about Jewish mourning. They wanted to get past it. They looked in many ways, again, I'm not speaking for any one individual, but this was part of the zeitgeist at the time, part of the cultural moment, that they looked at the European Jews as people that betrayed them. They betrayed Jewish pride, and they betrayed Jewish culture. They betrayed all of these things by not fighting back. So how are we going to commemorate the Shoah? It seems backwards, but the way that they did it, this pshara that they established, was to choose the day that actually spoke to, again, the exception, but it spoke to the thing that these members of the Yishuv really wanted to speak to, which was Jewish pride and Jewish strength. So this is not, the story of the Shoah is not about Jewish pride and Jewish strength, but that became part of the day as well. Okay, last paragraph. Which is why you can, if anybody's ever sat on a shul board or a committee on a shul board, all right, if anybody's ever tried to do anything, by committee. So it usually ends up being a contentious process. I'm seeing a couple of nods here. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. Okay, no matter what the issue is, whether to have assorted flavored lollipops from shul from the candy man, or just red lollipops, or whether the issue is to build a new wing on the shul, or anything in between, or hire a new rabbi, like all of this stuff. When you get decisions by committee are contentious. Government is messy because and always has been democracy because it's always decisions by committee. And this I picture. We have some minutes from the subcommittee meetings, but I picture these meetings of the religious and the non-religious, of the secular and the religious, going at it about how we want this to be a commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and they wanted to be like the 150 Jews that were killed in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They wanted the Day of National Commemoration to be a day to remember them. Like, people actually were making that case, where we have 6 million people to mourn. And then you have the religious people who wanted to make this like a national fast day. The Rabbanut and the Misrad HaDatot was going to get involved. There was a very wide range of opinions. So this is the presentation to the committee of this pshara, where they were going to make it a day of national mourning and commemoration, but they were going to use the date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And in this speech, he's talking about national pride of the uprisers. Last paragraph. אנו צריכים לבחור בתאריך מובהק, המתאים גם לזמן רוב השחיתות של יהודי אירופה, ולמרד הגטאות שהתקיים בחודש ניסן. So we need a day that on the one hand still is a day in which a major, significant number of the slaughtering in Europe happened. Really, you could have picked any day, it's like you just needed to pick a day that ended in Y, all right, to find the day that there was slaughtering happening in the death camps. But so Nurak is saying we need to find a day where there was great slaughtering that happened, but also a time of the year or tkufa in the calendar that the uprising happened as well. So he's basically he's talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as if it was this thing that was an example that there was hundreds of thousands of them. You can count them on one hand. That's why the subcommittee has chosen the end of Chodesh Nisan, in the days of Sefirat HaOmer, because he says that during the time of Sefirat HaOmer, that's when many of these tragedies happen. So I can't. I'm not a Holocaust historian. I'm a reader of Holocaust books. There were times in the year where, for different reasons, the Nazis' appropriations because of the war, times that the war was going better, times that it was going worse. Those were not always the way you worked out the way you think. Also, as a progression, the killing machine got more and more effective as the time went on. There were different. Once they emptied out, it was also availability of transportation services from different places. But I can tell you from in my own family's personal experience, it was Chodesh Sivan. In the days, it's Bet Gimel Daled and Hey of Chodesh Sivan were the days that the transports from the town in Transylvania, where my family was from, those are the days that they were carted off. So at least in my own family, this rings true. There was a lot of death and killing that happened not during this. But what you can do, what you see here, again, is that the subcommittee is trying to push forward an idea that commemorates the Holocaust, but does so in a way that was also honoring the strength and vigor and pride of the very few number of people that actually...
What about the two brothers?
What?
The two brothers are saved in the forest. They saved a lot of Jews there too.
There were lots of these stories. This is kind of my point, is that this actually is... Yom HaShoah is a mess. All right? It's a mess. It's not, at least in its establishment, it was a mess. And the reason why it was a mess is because we're a mess. We are, and I say it actually. I am saying that now with pride. I think if we look at all of the hafganot lately in the last few months, I think the fact that we're a mess is not something that's a point of pride, but the fact that there are so many different opinions and so many different experiences and so many different emotions and feelings and responses to the Shoah was a mark of, I think, the strength and beauty and depth of Klal Yisrael, and not a weakness of it. But again, if you appreciate the historical moment that it was. The early days of Medinat Yisrael, there were people that were at the helm or trying to project something, and they thought that a day of national mourning or a day of obsessing over death and destruction was going to undermine that. So we need to do something else. And yeah.
Rabbi, just a question. The official name is Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, Does that have anything to do with what you
Yes,
just mentioned?
that's exactly right. So the next thing so what I have down here, right? This was first proposed in 1951, didn't actually get passed and signed until 1959, was when the official Yom HaShoah was commemorated. Again, this is not. I want to use Nurak's last paragraph because he mentioned Sefirat, and I want to dovetail into that. But there's a whole discussion to be had about Holocaust commemoration in Eretz Yisrael up until this point, and then and before this point, right? If the major news about the death camps started filtering in 42, 43, 44 to the Yishuv here, and we knew everything by 45, then there was still that's a six year period between then and when Nurak is getting up and making the speech. So did we not do any commemoration until then? The answer was absolutely not. Already in the times of mandatory Palestine under the British, the chief rabbinate under Rav Herzog, who already started establishing mourning practices for the Shoah when we were still all British subjects, right? When we were still all living under the British mandate. Has anybody ever been to the Martef HaShoah? Right. So the much lesser known Holocaust Museum in Yerushalayim. Everybody, of course, knows Yad Vashem. Parallel to the establishment, pretty much parallel to the establishment of Yad Vashem, was another Holocaust museum called Martef HaShoah. I encourage everybody to go there. It's not going to take you very long. But it's a museum that's actually established on Har Zion, right outside the old city. If you look at the map of the Green Line after the Milchemet HaShechur, so the closest, anybody who was here, I know my father is one of them. I don't know if anybody else was around and here in between 1948 and 1967. But in those years, the closest you could get to Har Habayit, to the Kotel, was Har Zion. And they tell me that if you stood at one spot on one roof or on one Pesach and cranked your neck enough, that you actually could see the Kotel or you could see Har Habayit from there. But that was as close as you could get. If you look at the Green Line is going all the way along the road, and then it juts in to Har Zion, which is why Har Zion is actually included on the Israeli side of the Green Line. Okay, and that's why the Yerushalayim, the Old City experience that happened in those 19 years was happening in Har Zion. There is kimat, and when I tell you this, there's one building in what we would, if you look at the map, what we would call the Old City, that the line actually makes it through. And when I say makes it through, if you look at the Green Line, again, I only have maps, the historical maps I'm looking at. I don't know, I wasn't around then, I can't tell you, but the line that supposedly is the internationally recognized line, and what was the Green Line at the ceasefire line in 1949, in the ceasefire line with Jordan in early 1949, which is when that line was established, that line goes through a building. And half of that building supposedly is Israel, and half of the building was Jordanian occupied something, right? It was never Jordan annexed it, then they de-annexed it, not for now. So the line actually goes to that building, the Israeli side of that building. So think about it. We have a grand total of one building in the Old City, one building. That building was made into a Holocaust museum in 1949. That's what's known as Martef HaShoah. It's still there today. And it was established there was like 7 organizations, some of them government, some of them private, some of them from Europe, some of them were like the WZO was involved. And if you think about it, the amount of like brain power and money and energy and focus that was going into not much more than a couple of rooms, like half of a building, was immense. And this ended up being the Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Memorial that was produced by the religious. Rav Herzog endorsed this. And in 1949, it's a wild story. There are these Yuriat Sofeh from 1949. There are all these examples of bringing in relics from Europe. There was a whole to-do of ashes that were brought from one of the camps. There are people at Ayom that are skeptical that they actually were ashes from the camps. Somebody just burnt some napkins and put it in a jug because I don't think that that's true. But I'm telling you what people said. But because people wanted the ceremony, but they didn't want to be bothered with this, and they didn't want to deal with the Europeans. So they had this whole to-do, burnt Sifrei Torah, relics from the ancient Vermiza, Rashi's shul in Vermiza, which was firebombed and destroyed. There were pieces of the Sifrei Torah from that. There were all these relics from Europe that were brought and put on display and brought to Martef HaShoah. And it had a weird celebratory component also. And on Sukkot of 1949, some of these relics and remnants of European Jewry were brought there, and it was actually made into a celebration. And the idea was the same way that the Romans, this time of year, carted out all of the kelim from the Beit HaMikdash, we are going to bring back Jewish kelim to the old city of Yerushalayim. It was this very, very important cultural, special, religious moment. So what am I saying? I'm saying this because even outside of the government, there were a lot of efforts and a lot of focus on commemorating Shoah and the early days of the United Israel. And it was a complicated thing to do. The government was involved. They did establish Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem was part library, part museum, part memorial. It's a complicated place. Now it's the early days of, I don't know if you've been to the early version of Yad Vashem. So a very, very different operation than Martef HaShoah. So I encourage everybody to go there. The last time I said that I encourage people to go to Martef HaShoah, I was standing 6,000 miles away. Now we're, you just get on the bus and head to Har Zion. So I encourage everybody to take a look. Okay, what was, to respond to your question, what came out? The law that was passed by the Knesset in 1959. Three articles in the law. Chav Zayin B'Nisan, Article 1, I'm sorry for the small print, but I actually copied and pasted this from the Knesset's website. Chav Zayin, so you see, just to respond to your question, Chok Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah V'Lagvura, Day of Remembrance for destruction and strength. Chav Zayin B'Nisan, Article 1, Hu Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah V'Lagvura. It's the day of remembrance for the destruction and for strength. Mukdash Midei Shana B'Shana. It's going to be commemorated. It's going to be established. It's going to be sanctified from year to year. Hityachadut im Zecher HaShoah, in connection with the remembrance of the Shoah. Shehimisu Anatzim ve'ozreim al Am HaYehudi va'am HaYehudi va'am Zecher Ma'asei HaGvura u'Ma'asei HaMered v'yamim hahem. In the same article, in the same sentence, we have remembrance of Jewish death and destruction, but also Jewish pride and Jewish Jewish strength. Chal Chav Zayin B'Nisan B'Shishi B'Shavuot. Always on the 27th of Nisan. Originally it was on, I guess it was on Friday. Yukuyam. That was the first one. Yukuyam Yom HaZikaron B'Chav B'Nisan Shalot Toshan. In the days that Chav Zayin B'Nisan falls out on Friday, those years we're going to do it on Thursday, on the Chav B'Nisan. Yom HaZikaron Tehei is Article 2. Which is titled Darkei Kiyum Shel Yom HaZikaron. How are we going to fulfill this day that the Knesset is established by law? Yom HaZikaron Tehei B'chol Rachvei Hamdina Dunya Shel Shtei Dakot. Dumeh Shel Shtei Dakot. Bahen Tishvot Kol Avodah Divasei Kol Tzuma B'Drachim. This is something by now anybody that's spent any time in Israel recognizes. There's going to be a 2-minute period over the course of some point in the day where everything is going to stop. Yikimu Azkarot. Atzrot Am, everything's going to stop. We're going to have announcements. Right, so in educational institutions and in the armies institutions, bases and the like, there's going to be memorials. How are we going to fulfill this? We're going to have all of the flags on municipal buildings at half-mast. תוכניות השידורים ברדיו יביאו את ייחודו של היום ובתי השעשועים יעלו אך בנושאים החולמים את רוחו. So we're going to have these commemorations in schools and in institutions. Okay, so now it's interesting. So what is it that we're doing this concrete? When the Knesset usually establishes a law, okay, pick any law, they're doing something concrete, right? You're not allowed to drive on Kvish 6 over 120 kilometers an hour. That's the law. We're going to enforce the law by having speed cameras and policing the kvish, and then we're going to have an enforcement mechanism, which is that you're going to get X number of points on your license if you go a certain number of kilometers above that speed limit, and past that point you're going to lose your license and you're going to get fined, etc., etc. Okay, that's usually how a law happens. So here, similarly, this is the law. The law is we're going to have this day of commemoration of destruction and of strength and pride. We're going to fulfill it by a bunch of hodgepodge of a bunch of different things. The only thing that seems to be clearly, doable by the government is flying flags at half-mast and establishing something in government offices and army offices. That's it. So there's that, but then we're also going to have these other commemorations in the in other places in educational institutions. Okay, so Hort L'Kiyum Yom HaZikaron Asar Sheyusmach Lakach Al Yedei HaMemshala Yatkin. Right, so the minister that is appointed by the government to establish this, B'Tiyatzut Im Reshut HaZichron Yad Vashem. They are going to work with Reshut HaZikaron Yad Vashem, the Office of Remembrance, which was an actual office is an office in Yad Vashem. So they're going to partner with Yad Vashem in order to do it. Horaot L'Kiyum Yom HaZikaron B'Atem L'Chog Zeh. So basically, what is it? We're going to fly the flags at half-mast, and we're going to have an hour tekes in army bases for every single year, and then Yad Vashem is going to partner with the government to figure everything else out. So even this, it feels like it's. I mean, I coming in today from on the bus on the train. I noticed all the flags at half-mast, and it was a moment of reflection and recognition. But what is it? What is it? I think that there was, like, the tamtzit of it definitely is lacking, which is why I think that the fact that we're all here today and talking about this, I think, is certainly worthy of the day. I think that if I would kol echad lefi however you want to do it. If you have a family history, if there's a particular book that you'd like to read, I think commemorating the day in your own way, I think, is certainly appropriate. But because of the way in which it was established, because there was no concrete ways in which we are observing it. They don't even have Kasei Tefillah the way that we had them in Yom HaTzmaut and Yom HaZikaron. It left the day feeling like it was like it was without Chomer. It was like Chomer without form. It was potential without form. So okay, well, we're going to leave it there. I think that this is a very powerful and moving speech by Nurak. Certainly knowing who he was, I think it's highlighting a lot of this tension in the early days of Medinat Yisrael, and I think hopefully giving us a little bit of context for tonight and tomorrow for Yom HaShoah V'Hagvura, and giving us a little bit of an understanding. I personally today, I'm already 2 generations removed from the generation that lived through the Shoah. I think the idea of mixing in, personally, this is my own opinion, mixing in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is ridiculous. And I actually think it belittles the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I think that does deserve commemoration, and it is a moment in history. But the fact that we jumbled all of this together because we couldn't acknowledge and face a day of real mourning ended up detracting from both. So, at this point it has the strength of inertia more than anything else. And I think that we should, take it upon ourselves to do what we can to commemorate. Okay, so Nurak spoke about how he did. It was a small mention, but it wasn't mentioned. That Nurak said that this day was intentionally done during Sefirat HaOmer. Now, I don't know if he intended this. I'd like to think that he intended this, but he didn't say it explicitly. If you'll notice, there's very little religious terminology in his speech. That was the order of the day in 1951. Everybody got the sense that everybody was trying to foist religion on them. And again, in a country that was 90% secular, it didn't go over too well. But what I'd like to think Nurak had in mind, what was going through his head when he said those words, was that this is a very heady and significant and meaningful period of the year. Why? Why is this a significant period of the year? So not only is it the period that's sandwiched between the holiday of Pesach and Shavuot, not only is it the day in which we are daily commemorating the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer, not only is it a day that was marked with significant things in the Mikdash, in the times of the Mikdash, which we'll get to in a minute, but is also a day that monumental and tragic and significant events happened throughout Jewish history, not just during the 20th century, but throughout Jewish history. There's somewhat of a reason for this. If you know anything about just the history of warfare, this is around when military campaigns start, towards the middle of the spring, towards the middle end of the spring into the summer. Because in general, when you had armies up until very recently, armies that wanted to go on any type of campaign, they needed to forage, they needed to be able to march, they needed to be able to travel, they needed to be able to pillage, honestly. And all of these things were possible in the summer and much less possible in the winter. Now there are extreme cases of Napoleon and on the road to Moscow, and then Hitler 100 years later. But it's not. The point is that it's not for naught that this is a period of the year of much slaughter and much tragedy, and throughout Jewish history, that was the case. We're going to get to this Bezrat Hashem next week, Yom HaZikaron. I would like to speak about Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaZikaron and the mourning practices of Sefirat HaOmer. I think that those two really are very much linked. But it's not for nothing that this is also the time of the year that Chazal chose to commemorate, whether it happened or it wasn't happening. I don't have a time machine and I wasn't there, but the tragic death of thousands of students of Rabbi Akiva, some epidemic happened, according to Chazal, this time of year. And again, the disease also happens, by the way, when the weather gets warmer. If you know anything about history, this is a big piece of American history. Is that in the early days of Washington D.C. and in Philadelphia, all the legislators went home as soon as the summer happened, because as soon as the weather got warm, because that's when all the disease started to spread. So, for a lot of reasons, for a lot of different reasons, both military and pestilential, this is a period throughout history that was marked by a lot of death and a lot of tragedy. And it is a heady and meaningful day. And again, throughout many other tragedies throughout Jewish history, this is we're marked in this time of year as well. So I'd like to start with a little bit of asking a few questions about what this period is and how it's presented in the Torah Shelichtav and the Torah Shel Tanakh, and in the Mishnah of Chazal, and try and whet our appetites about how some of the topics that we do need to discuss over the coming weeks. So let's start from the very beginning, a very good place to start. Anytime we want to talk about Moadim in the year, the first place that we always want to go to is Parshat Emor. Parshat Emor, which we will read in a couple of weeks, Parshat Emor is the place in the Torah where we have the longest and most complete presentation of the Moadim, at least the ones that show up in the Torah, the Moadim throughout the year. And the way in which certain things are presented, the order in which they're presented, what's there and what's not there, every word of what's known in Chazal as the Parshat HaMoadim or Parshat HaMoadot, depending on where you look, every word of these 15, 18 psukim of the 23rd chapter of Vayikra are golden, and every single word needs to be dissected, because there's 1,000 things to discuss about every turn of phrase and every single word. Our topic is, I didn't have the whole thing here, our topic is Sefirat HaOmer, but I would like to point out a few fascinating things about how it's presented in source number 2. So we'll start with Parshat Emor and Perek Chav Gimel. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moshe. Daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem. Speak to the people of Israel. Moadei Hashem asher tikru otam b'mikrai kodesh elehem moadai. The holidays, the times of the holy occasions that are going to happen throughout the year, these are them. And fascinatingly, what do we start with? We're talking about the Moadei Hashem asher tikru otam b'mikrai kodesh. And the first thing that we mention is not even Shabbos. We just mentioned Shabbos in the context of Sheishet Yamim Ta'aseh Melacha V'Yom HaShvi Shabbat Shabbaton Mikra Kodesh Kol Melacha Lo Ta'asu Shabbati LaHashem B'Chol Moshevotechem. So the first thing that we mentioned, fascinating, the first thing that we mentioned after God gives us this little koteret of these are the days that are sanctified, is first thing that we have are days that are not sanctified. Right? The Sheishet Yamim Tavot, 6 days that you work. So it's a strange way to start it. If we were going to be speaking about Shabbat, we would start with an extensive discussion about what's going on here, but we're not. But it's important to realize that Shabbat is the thing that frames this whole discussion. All right. So what do we hear about Shabbat? We hear about it. It's a day that's Shabbaton. It's a Mikra Kodesh. We don't do Malacha, whatever that is, and it's a Shabbat for Hashem. The Chol Moshevotechem, everywhere where you live. Okay. We have another koteret, and all right. And every time you pay attention, every time there's a paragraph break, I accentuated it by actually putting a paragraph break in there. But that's the way it's actually written in the Torah. The Torah doesn't have, if you open up a Sefer Torah, there are two forms of separation, two ways in which the Torah is punctuated. The Torah is punctuated by the 5 starim, in which there are basically, you hit the enter space 5 times, or 10 times, 5 times. If you ever see inside a Sefer Torah, there's a big gap between Bereshit and Shemot, just a big empty space. The only other punctuation that there is in a Sefer Torah, everything else is part of a Masorah that we have about how to punctuate everything, where the Tamei and Mikra come from, how to separate the Psukim. All of that is Masorah. The only thing that we have written down from Moshe, originally from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe to Yoshua to everybody, to copy from every Sefer Torah ever since, is the separation of the Svarim and the paragraph breaks. known as Ptuchot and Sumot. Those are spaces or paragraph breaks that happen in the text. And if you look at a column of text in the Sefer Torah, those are the only things that you have. The places in which those paragraph breaks happen are essential. They're essential for understanding the context, and they are essential for understanding the content. Okay, so there's the first paragraph that happens, then we have another introduction. On the 14th of Nisan, we have a holiday that is Pesach Lashem. That was the day that is not, we observe Pesach, the first day of Pesach on the 15th. What happened? Why is this called Pesach Lashem? Because what would happen on the 14th in the afternoon? The Korban Pesach was brought. Then we have the Chag HaMatzot. We have Pesach Lashem on the 14th, the Chag HaMatzot on the 15th. Shivat Yamim Matzot Ochelu. The only thing that we see here about this is that 7 days you're going to eat matzah. Vayom HaRishon Mikra Kodesh. The first day of Pesach is a Mikra Kodesh. It's a day with Kedushat Hayom. Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Tasu. We're not going to do Malacha. Yikravtem Yishel Hashem Shivat Yamim Vayom HaShvi Mikra Kodesh. And you're going to bring Korbanot from Hashem for 7 days. And on the 7th day is also going to be Mikra Kodesh. Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Tasu. And then you're not going to do anything. You're not going to have. So this is what we call Pesach, right? Which is 14th is Erev Pesach. What we call Pesach is sandwiched by a day in the beginning and a day at the end, 1st and 7th days, and in the interim, the 5 days in the middle are what we call Chol HaMoed, but the Mikra Kodesh is in the first and last day. Okay, and then in this context, this is when things get wild here. Right? Again, a new paragraph break. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amar talehem ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem. What's going to happen when you come to land? This is a phrase that introduces lots of different things throughout the Torah. Every single time, it's significant. We were just discussing a bunch of korbanot. Korbanot we were able to do with the Mishkan. What we couldn't do is do korbanot that were centered around agriculture. All of the agricultural mitzvot in the Torah are about kitavo al haaretz. Once you come into the land and you become a people in a homeland that begin to farm, that's when you're going to do this. And what's going to happen when kitavo al haaretz asher ani noten lachem u'ktzartem et ktsira, when you come to the first harvest, u'vehevitim omer reshit ktsirchem el hakohen, you're going to bring the first of this harvest to the kohen. Vehenifet haomer lifnei Hashem l'ritzonechem. What are you going to do? You're going to wave this first cuts of the harvest in front of God, l'ritzonechem, whether it's voluntarily or because it pleases you. When are you going to do it? On the day after Shabbat, you're going to bring. Okay, not going to get it. Can't get into this right now. But this was a subject. Those few words, Shabbat, was a subject of massive debate in the early days of Eretz Yisrael and throughout the times of the Rishonim. Why? Because literally, what does Macharat Shabbat mean?
Sunday.
The day after Shabbat, which is what we call Sunday. Okay, but this is referring to the beginning of Sefirat HaOmer, which is not a day of the week. When is it? What date is the first day of the Omer?
The day after Pesach.
Right, which is also known as the 16th of Nisan. Okay, so Chazal explain to us that Mocharat Shabbat here does not mean what we call Shabbat, what the Torah called Shabbat 5 seconds ago, 4 psukim ago, but rather what Shabbat means in this context is actually the first day of Pesach. And for whatever reason, again, beyond the scope of what we're discussing now, Shabbat for here is what we say. The Torah says Shabbat, it means Pesach. Okay, so from that point on, you're going to bring the first of this barley harvest, and you're going to wave it in front of the Kohen. Pasuk Yud Bet. You're going to bring a korban of a keves. Uminchato, and you're going to bring a mincha. Shnei asernim solet belulav hashemen. Yishel Hashem reach nichoach nisko yain revitahim. You're going to bring a mincha, a korban of flour. And that's going to have shemen and wine brought into it as well. Lechem the kali v'charmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh, right? And you're not going to be able to eat any produce of grain until this moment. Until you bring this korban to Hashem. This is a reference to the mitzvah that we know that is known today as Isser of Chadash. Technically speaking, midoraita, we have a prohibition to eat wheat that was harvested at any point of the year until we harvest wheat, we grind it into flour. We're not allowed to eat that flour until the 16th of Nisan, and that's when all of the wheat that we've harvested in the past year becomes yashan, and then we can eat it. And there's some very important discussion that's not for now, but why we actually are allowed to eat, and here it's not such a big problem. But in Chutz La'aretz, it's a major problem. My father was in the American rabbinic for 5 decades, and this is something that rabbis need to deal with. Like there's no flour available anywhere, or there's very little available anywhere. So how is it that we actually? So there are discussion for another time. But for some reason, this is tied to this heter, this permission to now be allowed to actually have wheat and have grain products is tied to Sefirat HaOmer. So we automatically here have a whole bunch of strange things. The Torah is now talking about this day, the first day, Mocharat Shabbat, from the moment after Pesach, as we understand it, we begin a whole bunch of things having to do with korbanot, and we have the chadash is now allowed. All of this, I would say, is agricultural. All right, these are agricultural and sacrificial. These are korbanot, and this has to do with farming. These are the things that so far the Omer is about. It doesn't seem to have much to do with Pesach, and it doesn't seem to have much to do. Certainly doesn't have much to do with Shavuot, and certainly it doesn't seem to have anything to do with Matan Torah, which is going to be a big theme. Okay, so now we're Pasuk Tedvav. Usfartem lachem mocharat Shabbat miyom haviechem et omer hatznufa. And what are you going to do while you are bringing this korban, bringing this wheat? You're also going to start counting from mocharat Shabbat, from the day, same thing, from the day after Pesach, first day of Pesach. Miyom haviechem et omer hatznufa sheva Shabbatot tzmimot tztiena. What are you going to do? You're going to count from that first day 7 full weeks. So far, all we have mentioned is counting 7 weeks. You're going to keep doing this. You're going to count weeks until at the end of the day after that last of the 7th week. 7 weeks equals how many days? 49 days. The day after that is going to be the 50th day. At that point, on that 50th day, you're going to bring a korban to Hashem. So far, we sort of are being introduced to Shavuot here in a very odd way. We're saying that there's Pesach, and then we're saying that there's this agricultural point in the calendar where we need to bring the first of the barley harvest, and the barley harvest being brought to the mikdash and being waved to the kohen is the thing that's going to allow us to start eating grain that we're not allowed up until this point. And then, once we're allowed to start eating all of this grain, then, by the way, we want you to make sure that you also count these days as well. By the way, there's another paragraph break. Don't ignore that. It's essential to note them all. So the paragraph break, and now we want you to be counting these days. We're going to count the 7 weeks, and then at the end of the 7 weeks, we're going to have the day after the 7 weeks is going to be the 50th day. It doesn't say anything about counting the days. It just says that we're going to count the 50th day, and we're going to count 7 weeks until the 50th. The day after that is going to be the 50th day, and on that day, you're going to bring a new mincha, a new flour, a new korban of flour to Hashem. You're going to bring it from where you live, lechem tznufa. You're going to bring bread to the Beit HaMikdash. Shtayim. You're going to bring 2 loaves of bread. Shnei esronim solet tiena. Chametz pe'afena bikurim la'Hashem. There are many menachot that were brought daily in the Mikdash. There are a total of 2 korbanot. 2 that include chametz in them. 2 and only 2. One is this. The korban that is, we don't know that it's called Chag HaShavuot yet, but the korban that was brought on the holiday that we call Shavuot, and the korban toda, not for now. But in general, these are the exceptions that prove the rule. In general, there was an Isur Chametz. We talk about an Isur Chametz. There are 2 areas in which there's an Isur Chametz in Halakha. One is for the 7 days of Pesach, 8 days in Chutz La'aretz. The other, which unfortunately is not relevant for us, is in the world of the sacrificial realm. There was an Isur Chametz in the Mikdash on the Mizbeach. And for some reason, this is the rule breaker. We are allowed to have chametz. The mincha that was brought was not just flour, but it was actually baked bread that was brought to the mikdash. That was what happened on the 50th day the day after Pesach. Right? This is a very strange presentation. You're going to bring it from chametz. Pasuk Yud Chet. V'ikravtem ala lechem. With this bread, you're going to bring Shivat Kvasim Tvinim B'nei Shana U'Parvin Bakar Echad V'Elim Shnayim Yiyu Ola L'Hashem V'Nichatam Niskayim Yishelad Reach Nifal L'Hashem. A bunch of animals that are going to be sacrificed as well. V'Asitem Seir Yizim Echad L'Chatat U'Shnei Kvasim B'nei Shana T'Zevach Shalmim. So on this 50th day, you have a bunch of you have the bread, what we call the Shnei Alechem, and a bunch of animals. Chaf, Pasuk Chaf. Verse 20. You're going to bring the Kohen with this lechem bikurim. You're going to bring the first fruits to Falifnei Hashem. Al Shnei Kvasim Kodesh Yula Hashem Al Kohen. The Shavuot, what we have not yet still called Shavuot, is also known as the Yimei Bikurim. There's another agricultural mitzvah that was formed then. Again, to be discussed Bezrat Hashem down the line. We have a few weeks. That's for a few shiurim from now. So we have all of this stuff going on. Right, and the Kohen is going to wave all of this with the bikurim, and the chafalif will kratem be'etzem hayom hazeh bikra kodesh. On the day in which all of this cacophony of korbanot are brought, you are going to have another mikra kodesh, another day, a sanctified day. Kol melechet avodah lo tasu. You're not going to perform any malacha on that day. Chukat olam b'chol mashvotechem l'dorotecha. This is going to be a rule for all time, for everybody. And then almost as a throw-in at the end, which is completely out of left field. When you are harvesting your land's produce, it's the strangest thing that at the end of this long discussion, there's also when you're going back home, you're doing the rest of your harvest, you're going to leave a section of your field for any poor person that wants to get it. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I have 1,000 questions on this presentation. Number one is, we're in the middle of the Parshat HaMoadim. And if you read through, we have to stop somewhere, so I stopped it here. But if you read through the entire Perek of Gimel of Vayikra, I encourage everybody to do it when you go home tonight, you'll see that this is the strange exception in that whole Perek. Everything else is a recounting of holidays. On this date, you're going to observe this holiday. This is going to be Mikra Kodesh. And on this date, you're going to have this holiday. It starts with Shabbos, and then we go to Pesach, and we have this whole thing about the Omer, and then we get to and Shavuot, which is very strange, and then from there we get to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. It goes in order, and each of those are much more normal. And yet, when it comes to the 50% of the Perek here is all about Sefirat HaOmer, and I wouldn't call it necessarily. It's all about the period between Pesach and Shavuot. It doesn't even name Shavuot, and the holiday that we are having, it doesn't name it, but the holiday that is Mikra Kodesh is being triggered not by the calendar, but by what?
Agriculture.
What was that?
Agriculture.
Agriculture. Yes. So it's counting, and it's almost like it's the count it's post the count. We're going to count these 7 weeks, and then after that 7 weeks, you're going to have this day. It's like this 50th day, and then it's agricultural aspects of our agricultural life that are triggering a holiday, that are triggering a Mikra Kodesh.